Hello there, it's Mrs. Scoville, and today we are going to dive a little bit more into photosynthesis looking inside the chloroplast. We have three objectives for our lesson, which is to define the reactants and products in light-dependent and independent reactions, explain how the two sets of reactions within photosynthesis are related, and relate the photosynthesis equation to the parts of the chloroplast. With that first in the reactants and products, we're also going to have to look at the steps of the light-independent and independent reactions. So as a reminder, our general formula for photosynthesis is essentially that carbon dioxide and water go in and make glucose and oxygen. Those are what's going to come out. So we're going to look now at where carbon dioxide and water come in and where glucose and oxygen come out. And as a reminder, if we have it as a scientific formula, it's 6CO2 plus 6H2O gives us C6H12O6, which is glucose, plus 6O2, which is oxygen. So that's our overall equation for photosynthesis, but photosynthesis itself is actually composed of kind of some sub-reactions. That's what I'm going to call them here. And we classify those as light-dependent reactions. That's just what it sounds like. It's going to require light. And then light-independent reactions. Those are also known as the Calvin cycle, which is what I'm going to call them here in this presentation. Both of them happen inside the chloroplast, however. So both of these sub-reactions of photosynthesis happen in the chloroplast. So all of photosynthesis is going to be in our chloroplast. So in this diagram right here, I'm just going to kind of give you a little idea of where these things are going to occur. So here's our chloroplast. And light will come in, and this is our little individual thylakoid, so our granum here. And water is going to come in, and CO2 is going to come in over here in a different cycle. But our water is going to come in our light-dependent reaction. CO2 is going to go into our Calvin cycle. Oxygen is going to come out of the light-dependent reaction, and glucose is going to come out of the Calvin cycle. So we'll look at these again as we go through, but I did just want to tell you that right off the bat. Water is going into one part, CO2 is going into a separate part, oxygen is being produced from the thylakoids, and glucose is being produced separately from the Calvin cycle. Do you notice that these two together are all one big cycle, joined together by ATP and another molecule that we'll talk about called NADPH. Again, this is inside the chloroplast. Okay, so first we're going to dive into the light-dependent reactions, and I know there's a lot of text on here, but I'll just walk you through it. So the light-dependent reactions, again, these are the ones that require light, and this is going to happen in your thylakoids. So, well, not your thylakoids, but in the thylakoids of the plant. So again, those are those little discs like we see over here inside the chloroplast. And not only is it in the thylakoid, but it's in the membrane of the thylakoid. So I've got a really great picture to help you see. In the membrane of the thylakoid, remember we have inner and outer membranes of the chloroplast. Well, this is just going to have one membrane. So in our thylakoid, there are going to be these proteins. And really it's a cluster of proteins with chlorophyll called a photosystem. And really that's all the photosystem is. It's just chlorophyll and certain proteins that get excited by light clustered together. And these are going to be in the membrane, again, of the thylakoid. They're just named, kind of different clusters have different names. There's going to be photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. Both of these photosystems are going to absorb sunlight, so just light energy, and they will use this to make high energy electrons using water. So again, water goes in, the electrons basically are going to get excited using the water, and then this will go further, and that will help us make ATP and NADPH. So again, photosystems, they're just proteins with chlorophyll clusters together. This is how we're actually going to produce ATP and NADPH through action of these, and we'll look at these in a little more detail. The one thing I do want to tell you here is ADP is the precursor to ATP, as we already know. NAD plus, that's a plus, is a precursor to NADPH, and basically NADPH is just another energy carrying molecule. Okay, so I said this already, it's in the thylakoids and aka granum inside, so just to give you some bearing. All right, we basically have three steps to our light dependent. The first is actually that the light hits photosystem 2. So photosystem 2 comes first. Electrons are absorbed by the chlorophyll that's in the photosystem. And remember, we can have some other pigments too, but chlorophyll is our main one. And then what happens next is the water that was input is actually split into hydrogen ions and oxygen. And this is where our oxygen comes from. So the oxygen is released from the thylakoids. Next, those electrons that were excited in photosystem 2 are passed through something called the electron transport chain. And basically all that is if you look at this picture right here, all these little extra membranes, proteins that are kind of shown here, here, all of those are just going to be able to pass or shuttle the electrons. And looking especially at this protein right here, the energy from the electrons are actually used to pump hydrogen ions back into the thylakoid. So there's going to be less hydrogen ions if you look out here versus inside, so they're working against the concentration gradient, so they use the energy from the electrons to do this. And then finally, our last step in the light-dependent reaction is they started out in photosystem 1, now the electrons end up, or sorry, they started out in photosystem 2, now the electrons end up in photosystem 1, backwards of what you would think. It goes 2, then 1, and this is a photosystem, so it again is going to absorb light. This re-energizes the electrons because we already used a lot of their energy to pump the hydrogen ions out, back into the thylakoid from out, and here, these electrons are going to, again, kind of move through like a short electron transport chain, and they get passed from the thylakoid, which is down here, we're on the membrane of the thylakoid, out into the stroma. And looking at the structure of the chloroplast yesterday, remember the stroma was just the liquid that's basically everywhere in the chloroplast that the thylakoids are not. This is going to get added, these electrons that come out are going to get added with hydrogen ions to make NADPH. Now those hydrogen ions, if we remember before, got pumped into the thylakoid during the second step due to the electron transport chain. In the third step, those hydrogen ions are just going to move out through ATP synthase, which we've already seen. And this is just going to move with the concentration gradient. It's high inside, low outside. So this, in doing this, the ATP synthase motion will actually generate the ATP that we get from the light-dependent reactions. So again, just overall, light goes in, as well as water, into our light-dependent reaction. This will generate ATP through the action of ATP synthase, and NADPH is created through just hydrogen ions and our electron energy. Oxygen is also produced just from that initial step of using water. Now we're going to dive into the Calvin cycle and see how CO2 and glucose relate. And again, this is all in our chloroplast. So the Calvin cycle is called the light-independent reaction, and that's just what it sounds like. This does not require light to occur. So this can actually happen at night or in the dark, but it can only proceed for kind of a short time because it does need materials from the light-dependent reactions. As we can kind of see in this diagram, they're related. So these reactions are going to start with CO2, and the output of this is going to be glucose. The other reason I was saying these are related, you can't really just go on forever, is the light-dependent reactions are creating ATP and NADPH. We're going to need those in the light-independent reactions, or the Calvin cycle, as it's more commonly called. We're going to need these to make the glucose, and in the process, they're going to use that up and create NADP plus and ADP. So those are not going to be energetic molecules, so in order to make more glucose, we need more ATP and NADPH. So we'll look at that more in detail now. We do have a couple more steps to this one. Do note, though, that this is a cycle, so it's just going to continue, continue, continue. So this is going to happen inside our stroma, and again, that's the fluid that's all around the chloroplast. And remember, the light-dependent ones were in the thylakoid. All right, so our first step in the Calvin cycle, 6 carbon dioxides are going to go into that stroma in the chloroplast, so that comes from the atmosphere. And each of the 6 CO2s will combine with a 5-carbon sugar, and 5-carbon, that just means there are 5 carbons in it, called RUBP, and that's just the name of it. These will be combined by an enzyme to make a carbon that is, or say a carbon sugar that has 6 carbons now instead of 5. So that makes sense. You take 5, you add 1 from the CO2, that's 6. Each of these then is going to be broken into 2 and basically split, and this will make a total of 12 3-carbon sugars. So again, there will be 6 of these molecules because there are 6 CO2s coming in. Each CO2 is added to a 5-carbon sugar that makes a 6-carbon sugar. When 6 is cut in half, it's 3. Well, you end up with 2 of them. And the other thing to know here is that has a special name. So we started out with this RUBP sugar plus CO2. When this is split in half, it's called 3-PGA. That's just the name of it. So there are 2 of them. Right now we have 12 PGAs. Okay, after that happens, that 3-PGA isn't very helpful. It's just kind of an initial step. That's not something that the plant is actually able to use to make glucose. So the next step is actually using ATP and NADPH that was produced in the light-dependent reactions back in the thylakoid to take this 3-PGA, that 3-carbon sugar, and turn it into a different sugar. It's just a more usable form. And this form is called G3P, not 3PG. 3PGA is converted into G3P. There's still going to be 12 of them. It's just basically a different configuration of the sugar. It now is going to be usable. So again, we have to use the energy from the light dependent to fuel the light independent. All right, our third step in our Calvin cycle is going to be that a couple of these G3P, which I said are more usable now, are removed from the chloroplast and actually are used elsewhere in the cell to make bigger sugars, like our glucose, and other macromolecules as well. So that includes proteins, lipids. We're going to use the products from this to make a lot of things, but the main thing is glucose. So this is the point at which our glucose is going to come out. Oops, sorry, went the wrong way. Okay, so next, and this is just about our final step here, is the rest of those G3P molecules are going to go back into the cycle. It is a cycle, it's a circle, and they're going to be recycled and turned back into RUBP. And I know there's a lot of terms here, a lot of names, but G3P3, it's a 3-carbon sugar. It's going to be turned back into RUBP, which is a 5-carbon sugar, by adding more carbon to it, okay? This does require energy. You can't just add those two and have no consequence. So this is going to use a little bit more ATP that was made in the light-dependent reactions. Once it's at that point, well, guess what? It can just start all over again with the initial RUBP, adding CO2 to each one, splitting it into 3 PGA, and then it continues. Every time it goes through this cycle one time, you're going to have 2 of those sugars come out. So again, just a quick overview. If we are a plant, and what we're going to do is we're going to have some water come in. When light excites our thylakoids, we're going to produce oxygen, as well as ATP and NADPH to use next in our Calvin cycle, which does not require light, but it does require ATP and NADPH input. We'll take in CO2 from the atmosphere, go through the Calvin cycle, produce sugars. Specifically, we're going to produce glucose eventually. In the process, this uses up ATP and NADPH, so we have to recycle our ADP and NAD plus back to light reactions to get more energy, and it continues. So overall, I do want to just remind you, this is pretty much the same thing. We've seen this slide already, but water and CO2 were our reactants. One of them goes into the thylakoids, the water, and produces oxygen. The other one, CO2, goes into the Calvin cycle and produces glucose. So even though this is one total reaction, we can break it up a little bit further. And it's in our chloroplast. Okay, so with that, we are at the end of the lesson. You do need to summarize everything you just learned.